Now, it's my choice to preach on this, diverging from the lectionary texts that are usually read for this Sunday. And because I think it's worth preaching on, and there are many, I think, misunderstandings. This is Jesus' first sign. In the Gospel of John, there are many signs. About 7, I think. This is the first one. And it's the story of water to wine, so-called usually. And, you know, with the problems that alcohol brings people, and this being a story in the Bible, there are many jokes, inappropriately so, about this text. Now, something about me and my life, my parents didn't drink any alcohol. They even objected to it being used for Holy Communion. As Methodists, growing up, we stuck to the older disciplines, and the Methodists in our nation were principal movers for prohibition. I want to make mention that my grandmother, walking in the area we called in town in Ocean City, New Jersey, and it's a resort town, but it is also a dry town. You can't purchase any alcohol except at the drugstore, the rubbing alcohol kind. You can purchase it there. It is a barrier island. There are large liquor stores just across the bridge, the two principal bridges, of which, actually 3 principal bridges, where you can cross into the island. There is a fourth that I don't think has a large store for alcohol on the other side, but 3 of the 4 bridges. And my grandmother took me while we were in town, I don't know what for, but to City Hall on the corner of 9th and Asbury Avenue. Asbury Avenue. There was a Wesley Avenue too. And showed me a water fountain to tell me when I was 8 or 10 that if I were ever thirsty in Ocean City, New Jersey, I could always get a drink from that water fountain. That she and her mother and her sister had given money for that water fountain, so if anyone's thirsty, they could drink from that water fountain. A couple of years ago, I checked. It's still running. And it is there in the granite. The WCTU water fountain with the names of the principal givers. My grandmother is not on there, but she was part of the movement. That's the Women's Christian Temperance Union. There were other denominations involved, of course. Now, she never explained to me why it was important that I knew where to get a drink of water if I needed one. There was water available. Why I wouldn't just go and stay around where my parents had a place on the island at north of First Street on West Avenue, named after a Methodist bishop. I'd have to go over 1 block and then walk 9 further blocks to get a drink of water. None of this was explained to me, but she needed to show me where that water fountain was. Sorry to digress so far. Water to wine. What's this about? Well, wine is a natural process. And if you have an abundance of grapes, it's a way to preserve the exceptional harvest. And this was the promised land. If you remember, 40 years before they entered, they sent spies into the land to see if it really was as God promised. And 2 of the spies came back with a pole On their shoulders, it took two of them to carry a cluster of grapes that they found spying out the land. It's a very fruitful land. Wine is a way of preserving the abundance of the land. I think it's Psalm 19. I'm terrible with numbers. I need to look it up. But the psalmist says to the Lord, "You have given me more joy than when the enemies, grain, wine, or oil increase." It was a sign of fruitfulness. God's abundant provision. So in a celebration of a marriage, fruitfulness and celebration of God's provision are wonderfully appropriate. Now, there's lots of warning in the same Bible that Jesus' people give us against drunkenness and against following those people who regularly are drunken. So the Puritans would say wine is of God, but a drunkard of the devil. The Goy, the Gentiles, that word meant all the other nations of the earth, but it pretty soon had to do with idolatry, adultery, and drunkenness. Now, the danger of too much wine is wine always works. If you want to escape pain, it's a natural process and it's there. And it about works for everyone. So if you don't have restraint, it can be a real problem. And they knew that in Jesus' day. But to celebrate, most appropriate. And Cana of Galilee is a small crossroads town. The previous story, the disciple Nathanael, we find out at the end, where Nathanael is also mentioned, the end of John's Gospel, it's mentioned that, he was from Cana of Galilee. He said, "Can anything good thing come out of Nazareth?" Nazareth was another very small, insignificant town, as Cana was. I don't know if there was rivalry between the two. Cana isn't mentioned in any of the big lists of towns in the Old Testament that I'm aware of. Insignificant. But a wedding there, which meant probably the whole town and then some came. The fulfilling of the covenant that, a man had promised a family to provide for a woman who would be his bride and his wife. And when everything was prepared, he would come, there'd be a celebration, and he'd take her to his own home. A very, very big, significant thing in anybody's lives, but particularly in this nation's life. And marriage, well, God, through the prophets, often compared God's relationship to Israel as God being the bridegroom and Israel being a very unfaithful bride. And yet God still provides and will bring Israel home in right relationship. So Jesus is invited and his disciples are invited. His mother is there. And then his mother announces they have no wine. You don't run out of wine at a wedding. It's just unheard of. And Jesus says, well, what does that have to do with me? Now, Jesus sometimes asks questions so that you might think of the answer that's right. Who provides fruitful abundance in all the earth? Who provided for the promised land? Who made covenant with Israel That's God. Mary turns to the servants and says, do whatever he tells you. Now, if you can't follow the rest of the sermon, doing whatever Jesus tells you, that's enough. But I'm going to go on anyway. Now, there were these six days of creation? 6 stone water jars, holding 20 to 30 gallons apiece for the Jewish rites of purification. Stone water jars holding that much water. They're not movable furniture. They're there for when you enter the house and everybody's come through. And what would be provided would be water. There'd be fairly narrow, deep jars. Because one way of purifying water is just having a container or a cistern of great depth, and the water comes in and it slowly settles to the bottom. Which means if you stir up the water, if a lot of water comes in, stirring up the bottom, all the stuff comes up to the top and you have to wait for it to settle. So stone jars for the Jewish rites of purification. You'll pardon me, I'll put my Bible here next to this one. And everybody coming to anything at the house to purify themselves, particularly for a meal, and here's a banquet, they would take, roll up their sleeves, take their arms, and put them down in the water that had been still, and all the sediment of everybody else had already gone to the bottom. And you carefully put your arms down in and let the water take the dirt off. You wouldn't want to stir up the water. And then you'd put your arms down and pull them up and let the water, drip down, carrying all the dirt from all the day, from the marketplace, from whatever you do, and drip down into the jars. And then you could go into the house the rest of the way and eat. 6 days of creation, 6 stone jars. But those jars had been put there at the beginning when when people started to live in it. And so all the dirt from everyone, for I don't know how many years, and then everyone who's come through is settled in the bottom of that. Now, if you fill them up to the brim with water rushing in, all that sediment gets kicked up, and then you have to wait for it to settle again. So Jesus says, fill them to the brim. So they have to carry the water, which probably had some dirt in it too, and they poured that in, and everything's stirred up. Now draw it up and give it to, now the English Standard Version of the Bible says the master of the feast. That would be the steward of the feast. Who was the first steward? God created man, male and female, in God's image, and gave to them the command to, now, the King James would say, subdue the earth. It really means have stewardship over all the earth. And what is Adam and Eve known for, but for blowing everything that God gave them to be disobedient and bring sin and death into the world. Now, that's not the only thing. Fruitful and multiply, walk with God in the dew of the evening, having stewardship of all of creation. They blew it. The steward of this feast blew it, and it would be easy to do if you look at what they used, the letters they used for numbers. It's very easy to misread handwriting. So somebody's given an order and they look at it to fulfill. It's very easy to make a mistake, a 10 for a 1 or 100 for a 10. The steward would be the one entrusted to have everything just right. And one of the principal things has ruined what the celebration's supposed to be about. Fruitfulness, God's provision, great hope, because God provides far more abundantly and great hope for the future. I mean, it's a fairly devastating mistake for what a wedding's supposed to be about. Now, I don't know the character of the steward, but you know those people who are in charge of things to make everything's just right at important events. And if you have to serve one of those to be sure everything's just right, you know, and this would be a wedding that would be planned for months in advance, but was hoped for maybe for years. So probably if I were one of those servants drawing up muddy water with all the runoff of all the dirt that was on everybody, what do we call sin? What do we call somebody who's supposedly prominent and of moral character, and then somebody digs up what? The dirt. What's been going on behind the scenes. These servants would know how this steward has been, probably commanding and pushing them around for quite some time. And then everybody's dirt is in the water they're going to give to them. Wine's a natural process. You have to have good dirt for the vines. We are given life, and we're part of the life cycle, and one day we'll die and we'll become dirt. And, you know, the natural cycle is, you know, the body decays and new life grows from it. Other animals eat it. Who makes all the natural process, including the making of wine, which is fairly simple. I remember, you know, watching things of what medieval life was like, and basically to make alcohol, you mash up the fruit, you put it out with water, you add the yeast to it, it becomes alcohol. Grape juice, unpasteurized, left by itself in a fairly tropical clime, it's not going to take long. But for it to be right, it's not instantaneous. Now, the steward tastes of the water now become wine. He doesn't know where it comes from, but the servants know. And he goes to the bridegroom to congratulate him, saying, this is beyond what anybody would expect. Because everybody but you, everybody at a great gathering like this, and everything's arranged, would serve the good wine first. And when people have drunk enough that they don't care anymore, then bring in the cheaper stuff. And they wouldn't know the difference. But you have saved the very best till now. These people had all the promises of God. They had the law and the prophets. Their whole life was to be trying to have a right relationship with God because of God's graciousness and mercy to them, even though there were all these terrible things going on in the world. And they had to practice the ritual purity, but they were all relying on the forgiveness of God to take part in God's faithful promise. But it's noticed here that with all the dirt of everyone in the mix, Jesus makes it not just good, but the very best. So all the dirt I've made and taken part in, all the dirt that you have taken part in, all that's yours and mine, because Jesus is present. What does this have to do with him? Everything. Everything that goes wrong. It may take years, generations, but Jesus, like that, makes it the very best because he's here. Best of all, God with us in Jesus Christ. Amen.